Welcome to our second episode of Pelagic's Rising Conversations. Today in conversation, we have Dr. Div de Villiers, who, if you are regional or South African, doesn't need any introduction. So Div, just for new listeners and new members of Pelagic, just give us a little bit of a background as to why you are Dr. Div de Villiers.
Oh, hi, Chris. Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Div de Villiers because I've been in nature conservation for 40 years, just recently retired as the director of the Green Scorpions in the Eastern Cape. And I did a number of courses and studies and so forth over the years, eventually culminating in getting a PhD about conservation on the Wild Coast.
So today, why we brought you in is to for us to start this journey, we need a little bit of background on the foundation of conservation, a little bit of history in South Africa, touching on international matters as well, and then bringing it down to the Wild Coast and the current situations we are facing on conservation in the Eastern Cape. So if you would like to take us on a little journey with regards to conservation, specifically Wild Coast.
Yeah, Chris, look, I think maybe we can start off by just describing the setting that we're in today. We're sitting in the rain, and that little noise that you hear in the background is the ocean.
Little noise.
Yeah, it's Pelagic Nature Reserve, and a really stunning place. It's an area very close to my heart. I actually live here, and it's been a protected area since 1983. But it's actually been protected as a state forest since the turn of the previous century. Uh-huh. Yeah, so it was declared as a state forest around about 1900, around about there. And although we'd see a lot of grassland and that around us here, it's been a declared area for over 100 years. But isn't it a beautiful place to be sitting in and doing this podcast?
The Nature Reserve is a very special place also for the surfers and our watermen in East London. Pelagic obviously got a very special place in everybody's heart. Yeah,
now it's the South African National Botanical Garden as well, the 10th Botanical Garden. So I'm sure we'll discuss this area in a future episode.
It's not the first one in the Eastern Cape, is it? Isn't there one in Algoa?
No, this is the first botanical garden, a national botanical garden in the Eastern Cape. Algoa area has got the Van Staden's wildflower nature reserve, but it's not a national botanical garden like this one. So I think it was about 2014 that this one was proclaimed. Anyway, let's get back to the topic.
Let's go for it.
All right, so a brief history of conservation, and obviously it's just a very brief history. We start looking at the global context of conservation, where it all started, because conservation, the idea around it has changed quite dramatically over the past 100 years. But modern conservation started during the Industrial Revolution.
When you refer to modern conservation, sorry to interrupt you, why would you call it modern conservation? Is it things changed, obviously? Was there a new take on it? Was it a natural resource realization? What made it? What changed the times?
Yeah, but by referring to modern conservation, it's when the concept was formulated, written down. Pre the Industrial Revolution, there would have been conservation taking place amongst indigenous communities, for example. The Bushmen, or San, as some people like to call them. They had a conservation ethic, which they didn't call conservation.
Yeah.
The Native Americans had a conservation ethic. So when I'm talking about modern conservation, I'm referring to where it's been recorded in writing somewhere that this is the start of some sort of conservation.
So it was given a name.
It was given a name. It started out as resource management in the 1600s. I think that's probably one of the earliest references that we can look at. And that's when John Evelyn called for forest conservation in England. And the reason for that was because of shortage of timber, obviously, with the Industrial Revolution, using timber for all sorts of things like firing up kilns and, smelters, etc., etc. But I think, the real conservation movement started with John Muir and Guildford Pinchot. in the late 1800s, 1890s in the United States of America. That's when the modern conservation movement really started. So Muir was well known for his wilderness preservation. And I'll discuss preservation and conservation just now in more detail. Pinchot, on the other hand, looked at rational use of natural resources. And that's essentially the difference. Preservation is setting something aside, not touching it. And conservation is looking at wise use or rational use of natural resources. That was the fundamental difference between the two fathers of modern conservation. And then there in the late 19th century, you had the establishment of national parks in the United States, Yellowstone and Yosemite, first national parks that were established, and they basically protected landscapes. So there was a big movement at the time. Theodore Roosevelt was also involved and instrumental in having the establishment of those national parks back then.
So if we look at conservation back then in establishing national parks, and it started with natural resource management, and we're looking at forestry, is it safe to say that conservation was still fairly removed from the masses? It was still, you proclaim something, we can go hiking, but there wasn't an injection of information into, when I say masses, we're talking globally here.
Yeah.
You're currently in the US. So it wasn't no access points were made for people who were interested in conservation. It was declared. Basically, we're declaring land, we're declaring natural resource management, we're declaring this. There was no inclusion.
Yeah, no, look, in those years, I think it was a concept that the few founding fathers, people with some foresight, people seeing that there's a problem on the horizon. Let's look after these things before they're gone.
But a very separate removal from people.
Yeah, at that stage, definitely. So there were groups of people that had this interest, had this vision, and that's how it started. We move on to the great conservationist Aldo Leopold. That was a bit later. That was in the 1940s, where Leopold was probably the earliest ecologist in the United States, and Leopold wrote an essay, The Land Ethic. And his whole idea, and here we're already going to change, is that conservation should be based on sound scientific management. And he was looking at the human-nature symbiosis, and he saw, man as part of the environment, but preached that we've got to use things and we've got to use them sustainably. So here I have with me a little book. It's seemingly so insignificant, but it's one of the most important environmental books that has come out ever, probably. It's a Sand County Almanac by Aldo Leopold, and I'm going to encourage you, here we go, you can take that book, Chris, and I'm going to encourage you to read that book, because that's like a little Bible of conservation. Like really, really profound statements in there, and it sets out the importance of man and nature, and how important it is that we use it, but use it wisely. So anyone out there that hasn't got the Sand County Almanac by Aldo Leopold, I recommend you get hold of it. It's pretty easy reading, and it makes a lot of sense. So Leopold differs substantially from what happened in the 1970s, and that's when you started getting the animal rights movements. So the animal rights movements, that was more of a preservationist movement, and it's exactly as it says, giving animals rights. Now, whether you agree with that or whether you don't agree with it, it's a reality that there are these organizations with a lot of money going to them, and they totally anti-hunting, totally, in many cases, anti-utilization of certain resources, especially, obviously, animals. And that goes against what conservation actually is.
Yes. So,
come the 1980s, conservation got a definition, and the definition basically was wise use of our natural resources for present and future generations. And the emphasis there was on maintaining ecological processes and genetic diversity.
But also, if you look at the 70s, late 60s, 70s, you're looking at a decade there where there was the dawn of the activist, really. So by the 80s, if one looks at marine conservation, there was the massive Save the Whale movement. And I think all of us can remember that. Everybody had the bumper sticker, everybody had the T-shirt. Everything was about saving the whale. And I think Greenpeace, obviously, I remember growing up watching the work Greenpeace did, but it was activism. So now still we're the only human component, and I speak of the everyman, as I am one myself. There was still no entry point into understanding conservation. We're still looking at declarations, protection. Now we're looking at activists, which would be our human element, and we're being told it's scientific, which it is, and we should protect and conserve our natural resources. But again, so obviously you can see where I'm going with this. Again, the everyman was completely excluded of this.
I think you made two important points over there as well, is because the 80s, with the activism, that the emotions started coming out. And I think conservation isn't only about science, it's also about emotions.
Yes.
And I think that's very important. So I'm not discouraging or saying necessarily that that the animal rights movements are entirely wrong, or people that want to preserve are entirely wrong. I think there's a place for
absolutely,
for both.
But also, as we all know, as human beings, emotion can obscure a very pragmatic approach. So one would want somebody to have empathy and compassion and understanding, but without the scientific element to it, you're probably, if I look at comments on social, now that the everyman is involved, because it's a double-edged sword, you do have the everyman making attacks, and some of these non-profits are being torn apart on social media for using plastic in the ocean or doing things this way. You see how they handle an animal and you're just devastated, and that can also probably just block effectiveness of conservation because there is no scientific understanding or background.
Yeah, but at the same time, I think some of these organizations keep conservationists on their toes, and conservation departments and so forth. You've got to have some form of activism. You've got to have people that are really passionate about something, and then you've got to take let's call it the far left and the far right, and you've got to find a middle ground and find some sense in whatever the management's going to be.
Sure, but aren't we also then looking at including individuals who would, like you said, keep them on their toes, but a lot of the time you are dealing with individuals who don't have enough information to make the correct argument.
No, you're right with that as well. And you get a lot of money gets put into organizations that are doing more harm than good. And it's taking, you're sort of getting a little bit off the topic, I think. But it's interesting.
It's bound to happen.
Yeah, so let's look at the next step after the conservation movement. Rio Earth Summit 1992. That was the Convention of Biodiversity, and that's a very important part of the history, a very important milestone. So with the Convention of Biodiversity, there were three goals that were set. One was obviously conservation of biodiversity, and there were definitions of biodiversity. Then the sustainable use was the second goal, sustainable use of resources. So there again, we still got sustainable use, and that's critically important. And then we had the fair sharing of benefits of resources. That's a little bit of a change. There was recognition of forests as being important, and like I mentioned right in the beginning, conservation really started with forests, and even now there's always a call for conserving the forests. So we've had this idea of looking after our forests for a hell of a long time. You mentioned just now the 1980s Save the Whale. Marine conservation hasn't been at the forefront of the movement until fairly recently. So in the 1980s, when we start talking about marine protected areas, it's a recent concept, whereas the terrestrial side of things has been pushed, like I say, from
Yeah, well, I guess that's
more than 100 years ago.
Yeah, and that would have been a natural progression, I think, for humankind. I mean, you tend to understand what's closest to you, tend to see the problems what's closest to you.
Yeah.
And also Save the Whale was a very emotional drive. I do want to do an entire podcast on that little history. Everybody had the sticker, everybody cared, everybody was saving the whale. But were we? You know, and there was massive, and there's a very good book, War of the Whales, that one goes into the history of marine conservation. Now you get these wonderful projects and everybody can get involved. You're diving, it is more open. It's very common now and quite popular to study marine biology. A whole new generation is starting because we've obviously neglected it for so long. But I guess Forest did drive it, but we are obviously way behind on when it comes to the ocean. And what I wanted to touch on was you said something about these non-profits, but also how we can be told something and we don't know any better.
Yeah, I mean, I'll get on to hunting a little bit later, but hunting is a prime example. It's very, very easy for people to slam hunting, and
I was one of them.
There's a distinction between hunting and poaching. Man has hunted forever.
Yeah.
And there's a positive side to hunting. There's a positive side of wise utilization of your natural resources, especially here in South Africa and Africa. Africa relies on it, and relies on it not only for food and sustenance, but for an income from foreigners that are coming to hunt in Africa. But we'll get onto that a little bit later. Otherwise, that's going to be that's going to be a long discussion.
Quite controversial, and it's very difficult to adjust to that. When it was, I'm gonna be honest. I was, and I think that is why I can speak so freely. Is sometimes we're fighting for something, but we do not have all the information.
Yeah. No.
And just up until the other day, I mean, I was against canned hunting. I was against all of it. Conservation, I couldn't believe. And if you look at it, it's those farms and those activities that are bringing in most money to conserve a specific area of
land. We've got to be careful. The word canned hunting has got connotations. I mean, I'm totally anti-canned hunting as well. So,
but this is this, and then you travel and you get, wonderful people. Let's call them wonderful people because they are, but not always all the information, not necessarily. Conservation by now, as we all know, is economical, it's political, and people don't always grasp that.
Yeah, and conservation is a very complex topic.
No, it is, absolutely. And if one looks at the history, one can already see where it started. But I mean, it had to start somewhere, and mistakes were going to be made.
Yeah.
It's just we are dealing with masses at the moment that are uninformed. I don't like the word.
Yeah, so let's just complete the global perspective for now. As I say, it's a very brief touch on it. But then we had another summit in Rio in 2012, and there was a shift towards sustainable development. I'm not crazy about the word sustainable, and sustainable development. I mean, even less so. But let's go with it. They decided there's a new buzzword, sustainable development, and the focus was on that. I'm glad to see that it's shifting away again from this sustainable development idea. And
there's a few terms now people really don't want to use anymore.
Yeah.
Shouldn't be.
But, to get back just to your points about saving the whale, and I think the importance, you said, you wonder if it made a difference. I think it definitely made a difference. I think that awareness that created and the mass sort of uprising and the public outcry against whaling and so forth, it definitely made a difference. If you look at our populations now, the southern right whale, the humpbacks, and how the populations have increased. I mean, we see them off where we're sitting here now, and we see them just almost weekly. The whales, you'll see them coming through here. You've got mass tourism now in certain areas, Hermanus and so on.
What I was referring to there was not necessarily, I mean, it activated a lot of action towards saving the whale. And obviously a whole new wave of oceanographers, marine scientists, biologists made their way forward. But still, it was a very fashionable trend. And that is it was very fashionable to have the sticker, to have the T-shirt. It's very interesting history to read. And they did reach a climax and a lot of things were activated. And that's why it's a very important movement, because people do have the power. But then it went away again.
Well, the whales went away.
The last 10 years it came back again.
Yeah, but the whales went away. But it gave rise to all sorts of other things. People saw, hey, you know, we've got a voice for conservation or preservation or saving a species. And it was really species conservation. It's one
Pilot animal.
one animal in an ocean full of millions.
It's never ecosystem or habitat or natural process.
Look, saving the jellyfish wasn't going to be as great as saving the whale.
If you've got a funky-looking animal, you're not going to make as much money as a whale or something cuddly.
Flagship, and later on you had other things. So WWF, the Worldwide Fund for Nature, chose the panda as their symbol, and for a long time the movement saving the panda, which has worked. The pandas. And what comes with that though is that the areas surrounding that flagship species and a lot of other species get saved in the process, get conserved in the process. The rhino is another case in point, which is very topical at the moment. Going a little bit off now. It's sort of declining. The whole focus on the rhino, it's not as in your face as it was and as popular, but it still is, and it's still very important. But there again, another species that's it's a large animal, and I wouldn't say it's very cuddly, but it's a nice looking animal, and people want to look after it, which has generated a lot of interest, a lot of money, and a lot of interest in conservation. So it's definitely not all negative, and it's a lot of awareness that gets brought in about it. So, okay, let's move off the global side of conservation and touch a little bit on South African conservation. And I'm not going to go into the early conservation of the Bushmen and Strandlopers and what have you, because we don't know enough about that. I happen to have lived with the Bushmen in my army days for a year, so I've got quite a hands-on bit of experience with having lived with them, and I do know that they were very in tune with the environment and in tune with nature, and amazing people. But were they really conservationists? That's another topic that can be debated, because they had enough resources to use. I must say they were very respectful towards animals. If they had killed an animal, there was a lot of respect shown. But the first conservation that's recorded in South Africa is actually a 1654 decree, which Jan van Riebeeck brought out. And you wouldn't believe what the decree was about.
The Dassie.
You're close.
Oh, really?
Yeah, you're close. It was Robben Island, and it was the penguins. So it was looking after penguins in Robben Island. The penguin population was taking a dive as everyone was eating penguin eggs, and so 1654 they issued a decree. And not long after that, 1658, they brought out, unsurprisingly, a forest decree, because there wasn't much wood around in the Cape, being a fynbos area. The forest decree came out, and again, forestry then has a leading role in conservation in South Africa. And then with the Brits arriving, the British coming through, and the colonial laws, again, based on forest conservation.
Yeah.
Why would that have been? Again, because of industry and mining. So South Africa being forest poor, they brought out forest laws for looking after the forests. It didn't deter people from moving throughout South Africa and wherever there were forests, sawing them down. So the Southern Cape areas, Tsitsikamma, and in the Eastern Cape, there was massive forest exploitation. In fact, in the Eastern Cape, between 1847 and 1938, they reckoned about 90% of our forests in the Eastern Cape here were over-harvested, mainly the yellowwoods and so on.
So so for somebody who's not from the Eastern Cape, somebody sitting far away, explain to us, because South Africa is forest poor, and now we're going in and we're exploiting. What exactly does this mean, the bigger picture?
All right,
we want to touch on the elephants, we want to touch on migratory birds, we want to touch on wildlife.
So those explorers, or those, let's not call them explorers,
What shall we call them?
what do we call them? Those sawyers that came through from the Cape Colony to get to make money, to get wealthy, to, in some cases, to live. They would get on their wagons and they would trek through wild country, tough existence. Let's make no bones about it. It would have been hectic. And very brave people that were doing it. But they would trek then this 1,000 kilometers from the Western Cape. They'd get you to the Eastern Cape, to the forests on the coastline here, and some slightly inland, and they would begin with their saws, and they would take the tallest trees, the straightest trees, so that's for furniture and for, in those days for use in the industry and for kilns and for smelting and for the mines and what have you. And by 1888, the colonial government saw that they've got to establish a forestry service, so they did, and they declared a lot of the forests as state forests, giving restrictions, putting up restrictions to forest removal. Bear in mind, most of the people at that stage that were felling all these forests were white, and as Henkel was the first forestier in Transkei, writes in his reports of the 1880s and 1890s, and he uses the word Hottentot and whites. They were the culprits that were felling and clearing the forests, according to his reports. But coupled with the laws that came out then at the time, they also restricted hunting in the forest. Now, hunting was so it was a traditional form of getting sustenance from local people.
So we're ultimately looking at there's a great need for a resource, a natural resource that's being taken, and to be able to keep those resources, here comes that lovely word, sustainable. They are now, and to this day, because I can see we're going somewhere with this one as well, declare it protected, which is wonderful. Okay, and now we're starting the system here. But now to declare it protected, you're now kicking out hunting, use, other uses, indigenous, etc.
And even kicking out people that lived inside those forests. Exactly. So Henkel reports there, so like Dwesa, for example.
Dark side of conservation.
Yeah, Dwesa, they moved people out of the Dwesa forest and various other forests along the coast. There weren't many people in Dwesa at the time, but there were other areas where people were moved so that the colonial government could still extract the resource, but other people weren't allowed to take that resource anymore. Yeah. So there was some control, and the same with hunting. So hunting was stopped, but hunting. And maybe we must touch on hunting over here. It's been very important in South Africa's history, as it has been in many countries' history. Yes. So the San, the Khoi, the Khwe, depends how you want to pronounce it, and the Nguni people, the black African people, the Afrikaner that was moving in from the Cape and trekking inland. They were all great hunters, and they all relied on hunting. There was a big trade in skins and, of course, ivory and in meat. In fact, there were joint hunts in those early days between the black people who had excellent bush skills and the Afrikaner who had fantastic marksman skills. So if you look at the Anglo-Boer War, you'll notice how good the Afrikaner was with musketry. I mean, they were renowned. So when you say
they worked together, the Afrikaner and the indigenous people of South Africa, was it really together, or were the indigenous people being used to make the marksman mission more successful? What was the relationship there? So now we're looking at a situation where something's being declared, or even if there is hunting, now we're asking for a relationship, but we're also taking your indigenous land away from you. But we need you to make us more successful in your territory. So that partnership, was it good back then? Was everybody benefiting? Were the indigenous people, were they a part of this, or how did they benefit at all by being of service to others for the use of?
Yeah, look, I can't tell you what the split in profits were going to be.
I mean, the relationship has been recorded in history. What was the relationship?
I'm not going to venture an answer to that one. I've read, though, that there were these joint ventures between the black population in the areas at the time and the Afrikaner that was moving in and using that that bush knowledge to obviously get to where the animals were, and so they would they'd probably share in the spoils of the hunt, but exactly what proportions it were, I don't know. But
first relationship, yeah.
Yeah, so that led to game laws, coming out from the British government, the colonial government at the time, and that around about the 1850s, you had a whole string of laws restricting hunting. But here too, the literature shows you that the focus of those laws were very much geared towards the Afrikaner and towards the black man. Because the sport hunters, which are mainly the guys coming from England, they were considered to be ethical hunters, and the laws would allow so-called ethical sport hunting, but they were very much geared against the use of firearms and hunts for biltong and meat and skins and so forth. Yeah, and then, if you've got laws, you've got to implement them. And there was a difficulty in implementing the laws at the time, all the way from the Cape. So these hunting laws weren't working very well. And in the 1900s, around about late 1800s, 1900s, South Africa also latched onto the Western World Protected Area System, and we started having game reserves like the Sabi Game Reserve, which eventually became the Kruger National Park, and Umfolozi, that was in the late 1800s, 1890, around about 1890. Kruger National Park, by the way, was eventually declared in 1926. So it's one of the earliest national parks in the world, certainly the earliest, our first national park in South Africa. And the idea there, funny enough, was to restrict hunting and to prohibit hunting. So you could argue that hunters were some of the first conservationists in South Africa as well, saying, right, we need to set areas aside where we can't hunt and we allow wildlife to replenish itself. But it was also, like many national parks are, it was based on promoting nationalism. So the Kruger Park, do you think Paul Kruger really had a great role to play in establishing Kruger National Park? No, he didn't. But some very wise people decided, he's a good figurehead. He's loved by the Afrikaner and the Boers. So we can give it the name Kruger National Park and everyone's going to support it. And it was a sort of, in the early years, it was this flagship
it was huge
for Afrikaners and this nationalism. And it was so big and so successful.
And again, exclusive to... I remember my grandparents saved up their entire lives to just do one trip to the Kruger. So again, if we look at conservation today, and that's the thing is why I want to touch on the history of conservation, is today you've got schools have access. There are school projects, there are private projects. There's an access, but still back then, so where are we now?
No, 1926.
Still back, okay.
1926
so right
and
Afrikaner. 70s and 50s and very exclusive movements in conservation.
And 1948 nationalists and, I remember going as a kid to the Kruger Park and there weren't many other people there than white Afrikaners.
Yeah.
And Kruger Park was also run by Broederbond and people that had a connection with the government at the time. But it was a successful model of protecting a massive landscape and a lot of wildlife. And it was successful in nationalism. So successful that in Natal, now KwaZulu-Natal, but the Brits, remember Natal was the English colony, let's call it the British colony. Like Transvaal, where the Kruger was Afrikaner and Natal was English. And they wanted to copy the model of Kruger Park and also promote nationalism in Natal amongst the Brits and the people living in Natal, white people living in Natal. And they expanded the Hluhluwe-Mfolozi corridor at the time, around about 1930. And there again, we had forced removals in that corridor of the black people that were living there. So to build pride and nationalism amongst the white population, there was the alienation of black people that were resident at the time. This is very, very important to get this across because it shows that the resentment sometimes of the black population in South Africa towards conservation has deep, deep roots.
Absolutely.
So
But not just in South Africa. It's if you look at the indigenous movement worldwide now, I mean, they are claiming their lands back and they are protecting it purely because they feel that it needed to be protected correctly. They had, let's call it internationals, outsiders, foreigners coming in. This is the way we're going to do it. Call it sustainable, call it a non-profit. Here we go. And that indigenous movement worldwide, we're looking at New Zealand, America, all over, they are reclaiming because they know how to take care of the land. And the numbers they had back then, it was manageable. So without science, but you had respect for the natural land. So I do agree with you that resentment towards conservation and what it means by now. It means we're coming to declare something and you won't have access.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is the point. It certainly wasn't nation building amongst those the various black tribes that were around at the time, and they saw this whole conservation movement as a white invention. They saw it as, in South Africa's case, a lot of fences were put up there. So you had this sort of fences and fines conservation model, as it's termed in the literature, putting up fences and fining people that enter the area or that do something wrong against whatever legislation has been put in place. So that's pretty much how things worked until around about in the Cape province of 1952, we had our Cape Nature Conservation Department being established.
So we're moving into a new dawn here. So 1950s.
Yeah, now you started getting provinces establishing their provincial nature conservation departments and so on. So the Cape, remember there were 4 provinces in South Africa, the Cape, Natal, Free State and Transvaal. And they all established provincial conservation departments. So the Cape's one was based on, funny enough, fisheries and but inland fisheries. So the Jonkershoek trout hatchery was where it all began, and also for funding of museums. So museums and fisheries, inland fisheries, had a very important role. And right in the beginning, the conservation was managed by volunteers, honorary nature conservation officers. And not permanent people. And the focus again was on law enforcement. I think the first nature reserves in the Cape that were established provincially was De Hoop, was certainly the first or one of the first. And then your marine side of things, we need to just mention the focus there also was on conserving the stocks of fish in the Western Cape waters. So the marine laws, the early marine laws weren't really implemented along our wild coast and along our Eastern Cape coastline, only later. And then we get to the Bantustans, or the homelands of the 1970s. And there again, this is another milestone that we've got to look at. So roughly 13% of South Africa was set aside by the National Party as homelands, so-called homelands, but we were preferred to call them Bantustans. And they were supposed to be independent, and that was where the various the Amaxhosa and the Zulu and so forth were, let's call it, shoved into homelands which were allocated for them, small areas. And the National Party sought global acceptance for these homelands, so they established various departments like nature conservation departments. And in our case here, in the former Transkei, we had nature reserves, and also the former Ciskei nature reserves being established. Ciskei, Tsolwana, and in the Transkei area, it was Dwesa and Twebe and various places in Mkambati along the coastline.
So explain to us, because I'm going to, in the line of history, I think, because this was a 2-part conversation. So I'm going to draw the line there, because I think from there on, we're moving into a whole new scope. And I just want to touch on what you were just saying now about the declarations being made and now all of these state forests being, the movement really starting. The nodes. So do you have any reference? Can you illuminate us on what those processes looked like? Was it the government? So we're looking at government bodies coming in to declare state forests and protected areas, correct? And was there a system that is it different from the way they're doing it today? And how are they doing it today? From your 40-year history in the government, what exactly, if we're painting a picture, because still what I want to point out is we are speaking to the everyman, and that's the whole point as well of Pelagic, is to get the information out to everybody. So we sometimes assume that everybody has the same background than we do, or see what we see when we go into the field and we work, or how the system works. Explain to us how that system works. So there's Dwesa, we're going back to the 1950s. Us as a government, we want to protect it. We see the need for it. We see what is the next step? Paint us a picture.
All right, I'll tell you how things happened in those Bantustan years. Yeah. There was quite a lot of forward thinking, actually. And two very well-known ecologists were appointed, Ken Tinley and Willem van Riet. And they worked on the basis of community consultation was critical.
Okay, so you're starting with a whole new way of thinking.
Yeah, but remember, this is a model that they provided the government with. I'm not saying it worked that way. So if you read their proposals, they said these national parks or nature reserves, whatever you want to call them, must be established with consultation with the local communities and ensuring benefits to the local communities. And they spelt out, that there's going to be wise utilization. Tourism, people are going to benefit from tourism. The Sangomas or the Amagricha and Amakoele must all be allowed access to certain resources so they can go and collect the medicinal plants and things on a sustainable, I'm using the word sustainable, let's call it controlled way, and the way that they used to do it traditionally. So their model was a really good model, but the government at the time didn't stick to the model that was proposed by Tinley and van Riet, and they decided in Dwesa's case anyway was to stick to the fences and fines model. Funny enough, in Bophuthatswana, which is to the north of us, a different homeland area, a different Bantustan entirely, very near to Johannesburg, that's where Sun City is, and the Pilansberg National Park, they call it National Park. But that was established and also based on the Tinley and van Riet model. And they worked according to what Tinley and van Riet said, largely allowing the local communities to benefit from that nature reserve and have employment. And that's still functioning fantastically today. It's one of the big successes in established nature reserves and community partnerships, far more than the Dwesa example, which was a mess.
So let's do that quickly. So we're looking at Dwesa, and regional governments, I assume, decide to not go with the model.
The Transkei government at the time, okay. So the illegitimate homeland government.
So are we talking about literally just going and putting up fences?
That's exactly what happened. So the chief at the time was consulted, or was
chief.
The chief around Dwesa. Okay. He's actually still alive, and I know him, and I've spoken with him, and he admits.
What's his name?
Now you got me. Dlombini.
Would be nice.
So he was consulted at the time, but he also says that they didn't tell him everything that was going to happen.
Yes, that's usually.
So when the fences went up and people's access to the beach and to the marine resources was denied, that wasn't discussed with him. According to him, that wasn't part of the deal. Remember at the time that the chiefs, in the 1970s, the chiefs were. That was where the buck stopped. That's the leader, and whatever he says goes, and he will discuss things with his headmen and subjects once a decision has been made. Whereas today, there's a lot more consultation. So your question earlier on, how does it work today when a protected area gets established, definitely works a lot more different to back then, with consultation taking place and public participation. And a lot more science as well. So the chief was consulted, and then the fences went up, and then animals were brought in. And very little science to it. Animals were brought in from everywhere. And species were put on the reserve that never should have been there in the first place and never occurred there. So a lot of animals died. The Mkambati example, that's another nature reserve further north on the wild coast. There were even, animals were brought in from then Southwest Africa, now Namibia, from dry desert areas to a coastal area. And animals like giraffe were brought to grasslands, and giraffe need trees, obviously, so things just died in their droves. There are newspaper articles which talk of mass graves being bulldozed for the animals that died. You certainly wouldn't have that now today, 50 years later, but that is what happened at the time. Before we, and I know you want to close off, Yana, but before we move off the establishment of reserves in the Eastern Cape, and specifically in the former Transkei, a lot of people think that conservation and modern conservation is a white concept and developed by white people. And that if you read Henkel, I mentioned Henkel earlier on being the first forester in Transkei territory. Henkel's report there is that Dwesa and Manubi forests, two of the most beautiful forests in the Eastern Cape, were declared as protected areas, although not in writing, by King Sakhili, or Paramount Chief Sakhili. And that was before forestry moved in to the area. So King Sakhili was the first person to set aside forest areas where people were not allowed to harvest wood and people weren't allowed to hunt during his time as a ruler. So that was before 1888. We don't know of too many other examples. We did know that Shaka had Umfolozi and Hlahluwi as his private hunting areas, and many kings and leaders throughout the world had those hunting areas set aside for their royal hunting grounds. So that is a form of conservation and looking after an area as well. And no doubt there would have been other instances of rulers and leaders in South Africa, indigenous people that have put aside land for their use.
Okay. I really want to touch more on the subject we just started. So there's still a lot to carry on with, and I think we'll start with that on our second episode. What would you like to end this off with? If we're going to lose a listener now, they won't be able to access this again, and they are during a run 10 years from now, they might remember something from this podcast. What would you like to leave the listeners with?
I think it's the realization that we're part of the environment and have to look after it. I'd like them to read the Sand County Almanac by Leopold, because that explains it all. Mankind is not separate from nature, and we've got to use it wisely. We've got to look at science, and we have to manage our resources. They're there for us to use. We can't do without them. So that's what I'd like to leave out there. That people realize that conservation is the wise use of natural resources for our benefit and for future generations.
If they know how.
Yeah, well, that's where the
big problem.
That's where the whole science of it comes in, and with the importance of management and sufficient
and communication. I think that is. I mean, you were sitting. I think what I'm struggling with currently is, as you know, and a few people that I work with knows this word education, and for some reason, it's just over the years blown up this weird dredge of derogativeness, education. And it's lovely and it's awesome. And yes, we are all being educated. But there's this connotation that it only links to a certain demographic. And then now that conservation is on, for me, this is just my opinion and from all the travels I've done and hearing how people speak. And now that conservation it's a very relevant and current issue that we're all dealing with. And it's all hands on deck, but yet it's not. Because so many people have been excluded, and not just specific demographics or in the sense that we just spoke of declarations, but access to information. And if you look at schools, yes, you study geography and biology, but how much time was actually spent to teach you about natural resource management? Because we never thought we'd use it. We never thought there were other people taking care of that. We just go to school and we go to work and we go shopping and we go on holidays and we go camping every now and again. That's our lives, right? So we always trusted other people to take care of it. And now we're moving into a day and age where conservation is literally touching. If we look, we live here in this nature reserve, the issues that are coming forward, where very educated people, very well-traveled people can't understand basic rules and regulations being implemented. And then an argument starts. And so, you know, for me, I feel I'm on this for Pelagic, on this cusp of, we can keep saying take care of something, but nobody knows how to take care of it. We were never given access to the doing side of things, how to take care of something.
I want to sort of disagree with you in a way, because nowadays there's so much more access to information. I think it's I think it's about,
but you're not going to need
about creating a passion for the environment out there, and people have got to, you know, when before the internet and so forth, people did a lot more outdoors and were exposed to nature, and they fished, they hunted, they walked, they hiked, they bride.
I can tell you what, with this huge smile of us.
They did all those, so they connected with it, and you know, whether you in South Africa, whether you were Afrikaans or whether you were English or whether you were Xhosa, you connected with the environment. Whether you were a herdsman who was walking with cattle, whether you were a young Afrikaans boy going to the voortrekker movement, or a English boy going to Scouts and Cubs.
Scouts was a good and
girl guides, and there was a connection far more now than with nature.
I think what I'm referring to is not necessarily a connection. Look now, since COVID, if you look at the statistics, this wonderful article in The Atlantic. So now since COVID, everybody's rediscovering, and it's got words now, it's got names now. Things we used to do on a daily basis. For some of us who are outdoorsy, it's now got names. It's called foresting or naturing, and literally getting people back into nature. And it was a big thing during COVID. We all know the whole world went upside down and everybody rediscovered a new passion or a new thing. And conservation was the last thing we knew before the pandemic hit. So now people are going into now wonderful areas. And this is now taken from Australia, America, and New Zealand that I know of. Now more and more people are going out, venturing outdoors. And this is fantastic, right? This is what we want. It's holistic health as well. It's good for the brain. I mean, we can talk about this forever. But now those areas are getting quite hurt. It's more litter. It's more human. People don't know how to ethically behave outdoors. And it sounds stupid, but common sense is not so common. They are behaving in a way that they now want to deter people out of the parks. It's just too much. It's too many. They don't listen. They don't adhere to the general rules. And where it was uncommon, or popular to the extent that it was. I mean, how many people do you know when they go to traveling, tell you, they go, okay, your framework is a little bit different because you worked in conservation for 40 years. But that's why I love my position in this, is I'm so everyman. They go on holiday for X, Y, Z. Nobody's going to go look for a random hiking trail. So now where they needed that tourism and they needed these people and the mountain climbers and the adventurers that are now actually asking people, they don't know really what. People are being attacked by bears. People now want to shoot the bears so that they can be safer outside in nature. And I mean, it's just this. So what I'm speaking of is, and for me, this is the best example ever. When I started diving, you go on a dive and you see that reef, and it is the most wonderful thing you have ever seen, but you've only ever done 10 dives. Now you go on another dive and you build up your dives and now you start diving in different provinces and you start diving in different countries. Reefs are amazing. Diving is amazing. We love life. Then you start studying marine ecology. Then you start studying coral diseases. Then you start working in coral, and then you go on a dive. A reef you used to love, and now you dive and you know what you're looking at, and it's really not that fantastic. You can see the invasive seaweeds smothering the corals. You can see the coral disease. You can see the pipelines coming from the resorts. You can see the damage divers are doing. I've got a very strange relationship with divers. So what I'm saying is, yes, passion, but everybody's heart can be in the right place. Doesn't mean they're going to do the right thing or the best thing. And I think for me, that is, we can tell people to protect, but there is no understanding. We do not know what we're looking at. Somebody can say this beach or not this literal beach here in Kollega. I'm too scared to mention the beach, but the beach we just came from in Mpande. What a fantastic beach. What a gorgeous, there's massive erosion happening there. Give it another 10 years, those little buildings on the side are going to disappear. So when you are informed, you know what you are looking at. And I think that there's a massive gap, and it comes from every schooling system. There is no time spent to understand. And this is one of the activities we did with Pelagic is, here's a camera, and we gave them a little A4 frame. And we tell them to go put it anywhere. Don't tell them why, what the objective is. Go put it on top of anything. So if you're diving, you hold it in front of a piece of reef you think is pretty, or you put it in front, if we go on a hike, you put it in the mangrove or in the forest. Then we take that picture and we analyze that picture to death. I mean, we can spend 3 weeks on one person's picture. What are we actually looking at here?
A whole bunch of inkberry.
Yeah. This is a beautiful forest. No, sweetheart. You're looking at a forest of inkberries and latanas, Yeah. And then you touch on alien species. And I mean, the amount of people that honestly say, I did not know. I do not know. And these are your lawyers, your doctor. I really want to hammer on this education thing. It's information. And that is, we weren't raised to be in touch with this thing we live in, this incredible thing we live amongst. We weren't taught to understand it. I remember as a kid growing up in Beacon Bay, and it was still pretty wild back then, but I'm surprised, the father didn't shoot the leg of on, and we found in Pongu for anything. We found in Pongu Park for any animal that came into my house because my mother was hysterical, but it was a brilliant thing that back then in Beacon Bay you could have. I mean, the first time we had monkeys, because we came from Greenfields, the first time we had a leg of on in the swimming pool, it was devastating. It felt like I was living in an out of Africa novel, it was, but we didn't understand what we were looking at. I didn't understand the importance of a milkwood. It was my horse. Put a shoestring around its neck and rode it like... We didn't understand these. I mean, people used to take milkwood to make braais on the beach. Yeah. We didn't understand why, and I think that is... I think I'm sometimes torn if we're living in a world of misinformed passion or incomplete apathy. We're also, because that is what we sometimes see, people do know. There are people that do. Why are you taking balloons to a beach? Why are you taking balloons to a beach? Why are you still buying balloons? So you can go on and on and on and on. But when it comes to what are you looking at when you are in nature, you can be as passionate as you want to. You're probably going to end up doing the wrong thing if you're trying to improve something, Yeah,
but what I'm saying is you've got to like nature, and you've got to realize that you're part of it. And that's the start, because if you're aware of it and you respect it and you want to know more about it, then you're going to research it. You yourself are going to go onto the internet. You yourself are going to look at books.
But people don't. Lives are too busy. That's always there. That's why I said when I hear, I don't know, but we live in the age of information. You've got a smartphone, you've got an iPad, you've got this, you've got that, you've got Google, you've got Instagram. Why were some of us able to self-educate ourselves? And others aren't. So what are we dealing with here?
Well, it's important to have it at schools. I was very fortunate enough. I was in school in the 60s and 70s. So to have had teachers in that era that were teaching us about the environment, and that was just because they happened to like the environment and have an interest in birds, for example. My first headmistress was completely besotted with bird life. And your geography teacher, so it depends a lot on your teachers. Your geography teacher, if he or she is really keen on the subject, that's going to, that's going to impart on you as well. And it's going to make you interested in it, and you just do a little bit of extra work looking at books and researching things yourself. That's how the interest is. But I mentioned the herds boys at the time. They knew what was edible. They knew they'd fish. They'd be in the environment all the time. They knew to look out for jackals, and so that in itself created an interest in the environment, which very often isn't there anymore because we're so divorced from it.
Yeah, very much so. Okay, we've got 8 seconds, so I want to thank you for your time, Dr. De Villiers, and we will pick up on episode 2 to be continued.
Look forward to it.
Excellent.
Thanks.
Thank you.